Welcome back to the Shed. I'm Maxine Ficara, I'm PraxisAuril CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to a Shed Talk today. We're all really looking forward to hearing from Tomas Coates Ulrichsen about data, evidence, and the tricky question of just what is a good number when it comes to knowledge exchange. A couple of quick points on the logistics before we start. We're recording this session and it will be made available after the event to PraxisAuril members. Your video and sound is turned off, but please do use the chat function to send in your questions and Sean will line those up appropriately. It's helpful if you can include your name and organisation when you ask a question, please. Okay, let's get started. Let me hand over now to Sean Fielding, Director of Innovation, Impact and Business at the University of Exeter and immediate past chair of PraxisAuril, of course. Thank you, Sean.
Good afternoon, Maxine, and hello to everybody for another of our Shed Talks. And it's great to be in the shed today, particularly as it's a little bit cooler today, so it's not quite as steamy as it has been. And we're looking forward to heavy rainfall this evening, which is traditional because it's the last day of school today, and so therefore it's a washout for the rest of the summer. So everything's normal. Of course, the point about the Shed Talks is so that we can hear from important people who normally we would invite to conferences. And it's called a Shed Talk because I'm talking to you from my shed here in Devon. So you have to be aware about the noise of the seagulls and anything else that happens in the background. So today we're going to be meeting Tomas Coates Ulrichsen. Many people in the PraxisAuril community will be familiar with Tomas's work. He's been a long-standing friend of PraxisAuril. I think we kind of welcome Tomas's insight, but also his sanity. Particularly about the dynamics of innovation and research commercialization, and particularly because he is really understands the data that forms the evidence base for national KE policy, and indeed has been heavily involved with the KEF and the cluster models and all of that sort of thing. Previously, he was a researcher at the Centre for Science, Technology and Innovation Policy at the University of Cambridge and was Assistant Director of Paycheck, one of the UK economic development consultancies working for the same sorts of clients. But now he's the director of the University Commercialization and Innovation Policy Evidence Unit, which is shortened to UCI, but I think actually should be kind of UCIPEU, UKIPU or something. Anyway, based at the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge, and that's run in partnership with NCUB. And I think what the UCI is aiming to do is providing a robust evidence base for KE activity, and probably quite importantly, helping us celebrate the success of UK KE and thinking about future policy directions. So Tomas, welcome to the Shed.
Thanks very much, for Sean, for that great introduction. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, real pleasure to be talking to you and to the community about some of these issues. I think we're in a turbulent time at the moment, and there's lots that we need to be doing. There's lots of interesting areas where I think we need to improve the evidence, where we already have perhaps good insights, but need to communicate it better as well. So yeah, look forward to the talk.
Great. Well, it's great for you to be with us, and I think we are in a world first today as well, which we can see just in your background there, that you also are in a shed.
I am in my shed in my garden. I'm about 5 meters from my house. I should warn people that I live about about a mile from a sort of an airfield, and we have a big air show tomorrow, so we might get some Spitfires flying overhead, which might drown out the sound for a few seconds, but I've been told that that's quite a nice thing, so I've left the door open.
That's great. That's fantastic. So a world first, the first ever Shed Talk with 2 sheds involved. So very exciting. Some people will be not as excited as me about that prospect, but I'm keen on it. So let's get into this then, Tomas. So I gave a kind of brief overview of the UCI in the intro, but it's been about a year since you established the UCI. What's it for?
So, as you sort of mentioned in the introduction, the real basis for UCI is, can we improve the evidence base available? Can we improve the tools available to policymakers, to university leaders, to help make them make better decisions when they're looking to deliver improvements, step changes, develop new approaches around how they contribute to innovation, to socio-economic impact through their sort of more innovation-focused activities and more commercialization-related partnerships and activities and things. So the kind of things that we're trying to do is really understand the evidence needs of the community, of policymakers, translate that into studies, into targeted studies that we can undertake to help fill some of those evidence gaps. Some of the things that I'm very aware of, I'm sure we'll come on to this in the talk. I'm very aware that sometimes we just lack the understanding, or people outside our direct community perhaps lack the understanding of how universities contribute to innovation, how the process works. So can we develop better conceptual frameworks, better sort of understanding of the process to help people in the wider community or decision makers outside the direct space of knowledge exchange understand the process and hopefully make better decisions. Other things that we want to do are sort of, the data side. As you know, I have been heavily involved in the data side for many, many years. It is where it is. I think the UK has been blessed with actually much more data than other countries. There's always room to improve. And what we have seen over the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years is there's more and more data becoming available, and there's more and more sort of techniques to try and harvest that data and do things with it to help reveal insights into this kind of policy space. So some of what we're doing, and I know we'll come on to later on, is around spin-outs, yes, and a specific bit of KE, but there's quite a lot of data that could improve the quality of data that we have on spin-outs compared to what we already have, what we've had so far. Now, I guess one bit about why do I think UCI was necessary? Why did I put the business case into the Red Fund, and why do I think we got it? Well, over the last, I guess, five, 6 years, what I realized is that, talking with policymakers, talking with others in the community, people were finding it harder and harder to find good expert insight into this space, good evidence in this area. And this was quite a common experience when I was speaking to people. And when we started digging into why this might be the case, what we realized, there seems to be a gap in the system between what academics who are operating in this space, in terms of the time they have available, the incentives they have to engagement, all that kind of stuff, and the kind of the capabilities and the incentives and the willingness and abilities of people in policy or people in the private sector and consultancies to really engage in this kind of activity in developing novel frameworks in not just using the existing evidence, but developing new types of data and things like that. So there seems to be this gap in the system. And actually, curiously, you basically need people with the time and the incentives to really spend time on these kind of problems. And when you look at other policy areas in health policy, in foreign policy, in macroeconomic and fiscal policy, you see these kind of sort of units or centers, things that have the time and incentive to do that. So that was the rationale for UCI. That's why we put the business case in. I think that's why we were funded, and that's really what we're trying to do, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you're right. There is a gap, and it's remarkable how much policy has been developed over the past few years without any evidence. Well, certainly not very good evidence. So you've sort of become an expert in us, really, haven't you? So in the knowledge exchange activity and the knowledge exchange community, what do you now know about us, do you think, in the way in which you see us? What are we like? What have you discovered about us?
A complex and varied beast, I think, is probably the best way. I think that's actually quite true, in the sense of, if I go back to when I started in this domain, sort of in the mid 2000s, and you look back at the literature going back even further than that, and the kind of debate, it was very, a lot of it focused on sort of, the hard commercialization activities, spinning out companies, and there were fairly narrow views on the many pathways through which knowledge gets out. I look back over that time, a huge amount has been done to understand the huge variety of pathways through which knowledge is exchanged, knowledge is transferred, is diffused into the system. We know much more about the kind of companies and organizations that universities partner with. We know more about how they benefit and things like that. So there's been a huge advance in understanding about the complexity of the system. Now, as well, I was thinking about this question in preparation for this discussion. Because I think I was reflecting about what we know now compared to when I started at UCI as well. So we've done all that work a huge advance in understanding about the many mechanisms of knowledge exchange, which have been really helpful to broaden out the discussion beyond spin-outs and licensing over the last more than a decade now. What I was very aware of is actually there's a lot of interesting literature on how the functions universities play in the system. What do they actually contribute to the system? But actually, it's really hard to find a good set of empirical evidence on that about, well, how does, helping to provide system leadership to the local community or the local economic sort of system, how does that how important is that in relation to other things, for example? How important is helping companies to develop prototypes in relation to helping to build networks and all that kind of stuff? So one of the things that I know last year, as I was setting up UCI, we did this project with NCUB looking at innovating in a crisis and the effects of the pandemic on universities and how they can, and their ability to contribute to innovation. And one of the things, and I know it was a survey, it was not the simplest survey to fill in, but we did get 62 responses from 60 universities, and I thank you very much to those universities who completed the survey. And one of the questions that I asked in that was trying to get beyond just looking at KE mechanisms, to say, well, what are the functions that universities perform in the system, and what importance do different universities place on these different functions? And that, to me, has helped. I found it incredibly helpful. I think some of the people I speak to who've used the report, I found it incredibly helpful in trying to understand, well, okay, yeah, we engage in this huge variety of knowledge exchange activities, but actually the contributions are like this, or in here, or in these different areas, from generating new knowledge and ideas and technologies, for example, that can unlock new innovation opportunities, to different ways of working with partners to help them innovate, and to, how do we build the system? How do we strengthen the system that allows innovation to happen? And it was really trying to pinpoint some of the many and varied ways in which they contribute. So now I think we have a much better understanding about the variety of mechanisms and the variety of contributions, which when you start putting them together, creates a much more nuanced understanding of how the system works. So I think that's something that hopefully is becoming clearer in the system. But yeah, we're a rich and varied and diverse bunch. I think that should be celebrated.
The last time I looked at the different mechanisms, specific mechanisms, not particular one run by a particular university, but different types of mechanisms for transferring knowledge, it was 35. That's it's a good number to go for, but it does make, as you said, quite complex to engage with, and quite a lot of skills that people need to have.
It does, and I think so. It's one of those things. Like, it reminds me a bit of when you said, the current tally is 35. It reminds me a bit of the cost-benefit studies that people do when trying to evaluate the effects of policies. You can just keep chucking things in, right? And yes, we can expand out and cut yet another thing. And I think the point is that it's a very diverse set, and it will always be changing, right? As we find new ways of engaging, we'll be adding more, and some might actually sort of wither, for example. But I think that's the point, is that it's not just about a small number of ways, but knowledge is getting out in many different, and being exchanged in many different ways. And you're right, and then it creates a big challenge about how do we support all those things? How do we know when we need professional support? A lot of what the K professionals do. When do we leave it up to individuals to just experiment and try and do things on their own? That's, I think, becomes really interesting questions for universities as they develop their knowledge exchange strategies and support programs.
Well, and as more and more academics and academic groups are discovering the excitement of knowledge exchange. Yeah. So that becomes a challenge. So just thinking about the KE community still, and I'll move on to the government and others, the various other actors in a moment. But just thinking about the KE community, we are, aiming to be the best KE community in the world here in the UK. And actually, pound for pound, we don't do too badly. We are pretty much on a par with the US and ahead of many other areas. In fact, the innovation strategy that came out yesterday, for the first time, I think, recognizes that, which is really good to see. There's the statistic: a spin out created every 2 hours, which I found a bit hard to work out, but maybe some people have got fewer hours in the day than I have, but I don't know. How do you think, just looking at it from your perspective in the data,
Yeah.
How do we compare with international, our international competitors? How are we doing?
I think you've almost hit you struck a chord. I mean, we are. I think it's without a doubt we are one of amongst the global leaders in knowledge exchange. I mean, if you look at it just purely from the perspective of other countries looking to us for ideas and inspiration. In other people's eyes, we are a world leader, an innovative place where we're experimenting with knowledge exchange, how we engage with partners to innovate and to do other things. We tend to look at the US. That's our kind of place where we get pressure to go, oh, they're doing interesting stuff over there, go and find out what's going on, bring it back here kind of thing. Many other countries do the same thing to us. And actually, when you look into it in much more detail, actually people in the US also come look to us and other countries too. And I think that's perhaps the much more important point for me is that, we're amongst the group that has done this for a very long time, has learned a lot, is experimenting, is not very static, but we're all learning. And it's that point of we're all continuously trying to improve, reflect on what works and what doesn't work, experiment with new ideas and new approaches, and then try and innovate in that kind of area. That's really hard to capture in the data. And I think the problem that I've always faced when being asked, how does the UK compare, is that the data, there's very little comparable data internationally. So what you end up doing, you find those few points where you can perhaps crudely sort of compare on spin-outs, on licensing, where there is some data with the autumn data and the ATM data in the States and the HBCI data here, and you can look and try and. Now that gives you a very, very crude comparison on that very specific thing about the two systems. But on anything else, there's very little data in which you can actually compare. And so you end up going, and that I guess brings me to perhaps my biggest frustration with the kind of the international comparative bit, which is around, when you get people saying, and this often happens in the UK, we should be more like Stanford and MIT. We're talking about knowledge exchange as a whole, right? Well, what do you mean the country should be more like, the UK system should be more like Stanford? It doesn't make any sense to me. It's largely nonsense, I think. Because partly we're not then reflecting on how do the specific circumstances of individual universities shape what needs to be done, the kind of approach that needs to be taken. But it's really hard to demonstrate that empirically. And I think that's the biggest frustration at the moment. But all the evidence points to we're one of the global leaders, and we are all trying to find ways of doing better. And so then it's more about how do we strengthen the connections to share ideas and share learnings, and share the experiments that we're sort of taking part in and trying out here, elsewhere, and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true that lots of other countries are coming to us for advice and help, and certainly I think true that the top universities that are doing this in the UK against the things that you can measure are definitely comparable with if not better than some of the top universities in the US are doing this. So I think there's been a real change over the last few years in volume and quality. So
one more point to make on that, because I think the other thing that I'm always struck whenever I speak to people in the States, and I was having some really interesting discussions with people in Canada last week and elsewhere, is when you talk to them about the kind of the process of getting stuff out, of building partnerships, of spinning out companies, of engaging with local communities, the challenges aren't actually that dissimilar as to the ones we face here versus the ones that, particularly when you get away from the kind of the really big outlier case of, say, Stanford and MIT, you get to, Ohio State, or you get to McGill, or you get to, different types of universities in very different settings. We're all facing a range of challenges, and it's about how do we find ways of overcoming them. And so that's, again, you realize that we're all in the same boat, and we just need to find ways of solving it. And that's where sharing ideas really, really helps, and becoming more open, I guess. And I think the K community is already actually incredibly open. Well,
absolutely. And I think as part of the role that PraxisAuril plays is to connect up with people internationally. So one of your aims, I think, really in UCI is to help both us and the government policymakers see the wood from the trees. There's an awful lot of individual stories and and sometimes complaints and some real great excitements, but it doesn't tell you much about the forest. So what do you think the KE forest is looking like from the government's perspective? Do they share that kind of slightly rosy view?
So I think, again, it's when you pose this question, I've spent a while trying to think about this and reflect on what I've seen and heard over the last year, for example. And we're in a very turbulent time. I mean, it's plain to see. I mean, quite apart from the pandemic, I mean, with Brexit, with the new Conservative government, it's just a different government with a different approach. We're in a turbulent time at the moment. I think we then have to distinguish between that bit of the policy community and other bits of the community that have been in the space for a very long time and really understand what's going on, with the broader, I guess, policy community that is, perhaps newer to the space, coming at it afresh. And so for me, again, going back to what I said a few moments ago, we all know that there's many the rich and diverse set of pathways through which knowledge is exchanged. It's I helped to establish last year, and we've known for a long time, the rich and diverse set of functions that universities perform. They contribute in many different ways to innovation. I think for the first time, Spitfire coming up here, I think for the first time, certainly since I've been in this space, I've been working in this space, I guess, for about 15 years now. For the first time earlier this year, I was starting to sense more of a questioning of the status quo, of the ways in which universities contribute and the value they bring to innovation and the trends that have been shaping, I guess, a lot of approaches to universities in terms of open innovation, in terms of more collaborative approaches to innovation across many sectors and things like that. And I almost sensed a slight, outside our bubble, again, this going back to quite a simplistic idea of how the system works, where universities research, companies innovate, you somehow have to get one to the other and that is going back to, I guess, quite decade, more than a decade. I guess you probably have to go back to really see that kind of discussion being had. Now, I think with the innovation strategy finally being published, now I was nervous about the innovation strategy, about where it was going. I think a lot of my fears, I think, have been allayed in that. I think actually it is helpfully does sort of talk about the importance of the partnership between universities, companies, investors, charity, the different types of organizations in the system. So I think, how much that was just, sort of the people in the room at the time that were sort of raising those kind of questions. But I think we need to, what it does say to me is that we need to perhaps be better at communicating outside the bubble, not just the K community, but the bubble even within policy, that it knows this space really well, some of these ideas and the evidence to a much broader audience about the richness and diversity of ways in which we contribute, the value that it brings and things like that, and the evidence behind that as well. And it isn't always helped that the fact the evidence isn't necessarily that easy to get to grips with, or isn't complete, or isn't always as robust as we might like it. But I think that's one area where I think we need to do better. And the other thing other area that I was going to raise is around commercialization. And so I think that brings raises lots of interesting questions. And I've been in lots of conversation over the last year and before that as well, where you become very aware that people use a term to mean very different things. And this is causing, I think, problems in terms of what role we see for universities in commercialization. It's become the buzzword in this country. Other countries seem, the prominence of that term in other countries, it varies between countries. But that's the term we use in this country at the moment. Now, it's clear that, for example, some people refer to it to being the last step of the innovation journey. You developed a new product or service and you're taking it into the commercial space, the commercialization bit of the product and service that you've developed. That is how some people see it. If that's your worldview, that's your interpretation of the term, you'll probably end up with a certain view of universities in the commercialization process, a certain view, and perhaps it's a less important view than the role of the private sector and markets in shaping what can be done. For a lot of the community that's much closer to the research base, that a lot of people use the term commercialization to mean the journey of the idea or the technology out of the research base into the commercial sphere. And that's much earlier in the process, a lot more further development and demonstration has to take place before you can get to the taking it into the marketplace. But some people use commercialization to mean that journey from idea to market. And then you get a third interpretation, depending on where you sit as well, where it's become a bit of a shorthand for a specific set of knowledge exchange pathways around spinning out a company, taking the knowledge into the commercial setting through spin outs and through technology licensing. So again, these three very different interpretations of the word commercialization. Now, depending on where you sit, you end up with a very different view of what needs to be done or what role universities can play in the process. So one of the things we're trying to do, I guess, over the next few months is trying to bring some clarity to that debate and say, actually, can we develop some kind of conceptual framework which is trying to reveal some of these differences, so people can maybe at least see themselves in different bits of the framework and say, actually, okay, yeah, we're using the same term, but actually we can see why it might be different, I guess.
Yeah, and the question of you can only really do commercialization if you've already built up a level of engagement with the people you want to commercialize with. So there's so the whole idea of knowledge exchange being a much broader set of engagements with potential partners, many of which don't turn into partners at all. That often gets lost in the story, doesn't it? And that I mean, it's interesting you say that commercialization is the buzzword, because everything that we're having to do at the moment has got KE, at the front of it.
Again, if you go outside our bubble, what I'm hearing is much more on the word commercialization. Yeah. And I think that's the curious thing for me, is that we do, there's a danger that we operate in this space where we have our language, we know, we use it in a certain way to mean certain things, but actually go far outside the kind of this policy space or this way. People are making decisions and making inferences about how universities contribute, and that language might not have put have spread into that kind of space, and so we don't have not using necessarily the same terms. So I think it comes out of bit in the innovation strategy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that implies then that while we've kind of won the conversation in relation to the parts of the infrastructure that know us, and we feel as if actually now everyone believes that knowledge exchange is the thing, and we all know what that is. There's an endless process of making sure that everyone else understands that too, because otherwise they just fall back to the obvious. And it's a situation we're always in universities where a new set of people come onto the university council and then say, why aren't you making more money from this activity? And presumably the same thing is happening with government bodies and ministers, etc. So I just want to remind everybody to put your, if there are any questions you have, to put them in the chat, and I will come to them. And Mark Gray has just put something in the chat around this commercialization piece and how it's measured, and the difference between building commercialization through R&D, for example, as well as through IP. I think we'll come back to that in a second, because I've got we need to get into the point about how we measure this in a minute. I wanted to dwell a moment or two, if I could, on, you touched on the innovation strategy having come out yesterday. And actually you said you were feeling a little bit more positive about it. I mean, I think my overriding feeling reading it was how little universities were mentioned in the whole thing, and it sort of read as if the university bit's sorted out. We've given them a little bit of money here and there to do stuff. We've got this HIFE thing. We've got some CCF money and some strength in places things, and the university bit can just carry on. But it's the businesses we need to do lots of work on. Of course, the other end of the telescope, I'm telling the people in my university, there's 22 billion, but it's not coming to you, and unless you work with these businesses more effectively. So there's an interesting, felt like an interesting tension. So What do you think? You know, you said you felt more positive about it. What, you know, just in terms of the broad strands of the innovation strategy, do you feel reassured about it?
So, so it came out, by the time I got round to reading it yesterday, it was in the evening. So I've skim read it. I haven't gone into the full details, but and I think we mustn't also forget that, so it's the innovation strategy. It's not necessarily a kind of a university's innovation strategy. So it is, we mustn't forget that there are big problems, I think, on the demand side, in the pull through, the ability of the system to pull through ideas into innovations and generate value for the UK economy. And I think it tries to, I guess, address some of those kind of big problems. Now, I agree with you. I think that perhaps there could be more in terms of how that then links back into university. I think there was some stuff, I guess, around the role of universities in that process. There was talk around, you know, strengthening the interaction between university and business, to particularly around the I think it was around the innovation missions, around it, particularly also in terms of commercialization and the emerging technologies bit as well. But I think, so generally speaking, in terms of trying to read that in the context of other things that have been coming out, and there have been a lot of plans and strategies coming out in the last year and a half, I guess. The general sense that I got in terms of like directions of travel was, you know, more mission-led, challenge-led, to go after societal, you know, complex societal and industrial challenges. Much greater emphasis than we've seen in the past on commercializing emerging technologies, you know, sort of, and within that, I guess, a much stronger focus than we've seen before on spin-outs as one of the key routes to do that. I think that's where there are some interesting questions to ask around that. Yes, the importance of research excellence, but I think the real focus now, and I see, just looking at the various plans and also in the innovation strategy, around the ability to translate research outputs into innovative applications. It's the translational bit, it's the commercialization bit. So yes, great science, but all this other stuff too. So I think the point about, you know, the kind of the 22 billion, the question is, where is it going to go? And I don't think, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the spending review. And I think that the general message to me is yes, but in terms of the innovation strategy, yes, but we need to be, now all eyes are on the spending review and what does it actually translate into money on the ground and the types of programs that are actually funded on the ground. You know, attracting, retaining talent and things like that, building the, you know, revisiting the kind of the R&D innovation infrastructure, and of course leveling up being a really important lens now through which a lot of things are being seen. But again, like a lot of this, you know, you know, translating the ambition into concrete programs with budgets attached to them is the next big step. And I guess what I, you know, flicking through the innovation strategy yesterday, and for my sins, looking in detail at the developments in the US with the act of Congress in May, from the Senate at least, around the US Innovation and Competition Act, and the scale of the ambition and the money being attached. Look, whether or not that actually materializes once it goes through Congress, but the scale of the ambition is very evident there. And actually, when you read through that document, it's very clear the role that universities play in trying to extend and push out the role of universities from the basic research into the kind of the more technology development demonstration phases of the innovation sort of pipeline or process. And also in that plan as well, in terms of regional diversification, reaching out beyond the traditional innovation pole, the technology innovation poles of the US. So you see bits of that in the UK one, but I think for me, it's all eyes on the spending review. It's about how do we translate that into actual programs? And that's where we see, you know, what does it mean for universities in terms of programs and things like that in that. So I think we've got some work to do between now and then to try and raise our understanding. Well, that's the ambition, trying to get things, you know, sort of from research into innovative applications in the UK. We need to work and explain how that happens and the role of universities in that process at different points along that process. It's not this linear process where we sort of, you know, create loads of new knowledge and then we throw it over the wall that things happen. The other thing that, just reflecting on the focus of the innovation strategy, the other thing that I picked up was a lot of the attention was on kind of disruptive innovation in frontier sectors, you know, industries of the future and things like that. And yes, there were nods to incremental innovation or adoption of innovations in kind of less productive companies to help them innovate, raise the overall levels of innovation and productivity. But actually, there's another big bit of the puzzle, which is what do you do for the kind of what you might call legacy sectors or more mature industries where there are some big barriers to innovation? How do we get, even disruptive innovations into those kind of sectors as well to help improve the overall sort of productivity of those sectors, to open up new opportunities and ways of doing things in those perhaps more mature industries, and obviously manufacturing, but then also what about services too? So I think there's some interesting questions that things need to be unpicked as well in lots of these areas. So yeah, I think for me, all eyes on the spending review as to what it actually means for the university base.
There's quite a lot of concern, and it's I think echoed by Bruce Etherington writing in the chat about it feels very much like a STEM-driven innovation strategy. And of course, there's a lot of, the UK has great strengths in the creative sector and in the social sciences, and yet the cultural sciences, and people, it feels quite hard for them to get a handhold into these strategies. Is that how you see it?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think, again, I flicked through it, so I didn't, but I think the general sense is in the UK, the dialogue seems to be more technology focused. Curiously, once you move to innovate, so in mission driven and outcome driven or challenge driven, to my mind, you get away from some of these issues. In that, we know if you're going to, sort of find solutions to tackle climate change, you don't have to. It's not just about developing the technology. You need to know whether the public's going to, how are we going to change behaviors? We need to know whether certain approaches are going to be acceptable or be seen as legitimate. You need to know, with digital AI, you need to understand the ethical implications. All areas where the social sciences have huge roles to play. The future of work, and that's not going to be, it's not just a sort of technology question. It's about behavioral questions and things like that. So I think once you get into mission-driven, challenge-driven, think about the outcomes you want to achieve, it becomes easy to have some of those conversations about how do we bring the different disciplines together to unlock new opportunities to go after new solutions and things like that. I think we are perhaps stuck in a bit of a kind of some of the path dependence, almost like the legacy of we tend to focus on technology. It's easier to talk about an idea into technology, into prototype, into raising money on the capital markets and growing into a company, and then you tend to gravitate towards tech, and coming out of STEM. And it would be great to see. I know LSE is doing some really great work on commercializing the social sciences. And again, how do we amplify that and really bring that out more? I think we do as a community need to do more about celebrating the engagement from the non-STEM. But again, for me, it's how do we bring those together as well, and at the interface. So it's not just about the danger about commercializing social sciences. You kind of get into social sciences into policy or to charities, STEM into R&D intensive industries, and actually it's the convergence of the two, which I think is really interesting and exciting.
Yeah, so we should focus on the missions, really. That's
outcome driven, mission driven, challenge driven. Is what do you want to achieve, and then work back as to who needs to be involved. But that's a mindset change, and that's not easy to deliver.
You're right, but I think very important, if you can build partnerships across organisations like universities to bring in the best of the social sciences and humanities and arts into these missions, I think those will be the powerful ones that will succeed. So let's come on to your favourite topic now, then, which is all the work you've done on trying to measure KE over the past few years. You must have worked out by now, what's the best number to use, and we're all very excited to hear. What do you think the best number to measure is in knowledge exchange?
Let's call it 42, and just end the conversation here. Right? It's I think I have spent many years knee deep in data, HVCI and other data sets, and trying to figure out how do you capture this, how do you measure it, how do you use the. And I think the problem is that if we overly focus on the perfect measure, we're never really going to get. It's never going to be the perfect measure. We're always going to sort of fail if that's the goal, because we're never going to get to an ability to say you know, let's capture the, you know, full economic and social impact of the activities that we undertake, of knowledge exchange activities that we undertake. We'll never get that. It's too difficult. It's too, I'd say it's almost impossible. The classic things of the impacts are far too far in the future, take too long to materialize. There's lots of other things that have to happen to enable those to happen. So how do you attribute it back to the activity in the first place? So there's been a sort of a trend in the kind of, in the academic literature, and as well as, I think it's then feeding into some of the policy discourse around this as well, saying, well, if you can't get to that, what can you do that's useful and practical? And it's around thinking about what you might call trajectory measures, around progression measures. So the question then becomes, how do we try and show through data and other means that the knowledge that's being created within a university setting, you know, by academics or through partnerships with companies and charities and others, how do we show that it's getting out of this university setting and being used in some way in the economic system, in the societal, in the social system, and it's progressing towards some kind of application, some kind of use in practice? And that's where I think I've gravitated towards over the last, you know, 5-10 years, probably 5 years, I guess. That's where the idea of saying, let's look at income as a proxy for impact comes from, in that you're trying to say, can we get hints of knowledge being sort of, you know, acquired and used and taken up? Now, again, there's no perfect metric. You know, the impact as a proxy for income is predicated on the idea that if an organization pays for something, they must at least see some value in it to their organization, that assumes rationality of the organization itself. You know, that breaks down in certain circumstances. You know, I think, you know, massively cash rich, say, tech firms might have other reasons for throwing money at universities to do something. But I think by and large, you know, particularly, you know, SMEs are not going to throw, you know, even small amounts of money around if they don't see there's value in doing it. And so that's always been the justification for using impact as a proxy for income, income as a proxy for impact. Now, we all know it's not perfect. We all know it misses loads of stuff. But at the system level, at the sort of, you know, aggregate levels, it does provide a really useful tool for trying to say, we're not just creating knowledge, but it seems to be getting out there, and it seems to be, organizations seem to attach some value to it. You then try, in my head then, you then try and say, can we periodically, you know, explore whether the organizations are able to not just acquire, but do something with it? And that's where surveys or case studies really come into play to try and understand, I think, how, you know, whether or not there are the ability of those organizations to then do something with it and turn it into innovative new processes or products. But that's not something I think you can easily measure on a yearly, you know, automatically or on a yearly basis. It's something you probably invest time in every so often to say, you know, let's now check again, you know, do a kind of a health check once every few years as to whether or not the system is actually doing well and actually taking the stuff up and actually doing something with it. So I think, yeah, it's trying to understand, you know, is it being used? Is it being valued by the system in some way? And then you have to rely on the system to actually do something with it. And that's, we're in a market-driven economy. That's the market's trying to do stuff with it. And if they can get then, you know, companies or other organizations see a use for it and can, you know, sort of find the investment to take it further, then they will.
There's a bit of a challenge, isn't there, with using the income that an organization gets from another organization to be the proxy for the benefit that it gets. And one of the concerns I have with the HEBC data is that it seems to show actually quite a small number to government. You know, 4.5 billion in the great scheme of things is not a large number when you think about all the effort and energy that goes into funding you know, research organizations. But if you assume that that is just the amount of money that someone's prepared to pay, they will have expected a return on that, which will have been significantly more than that, you would expect. So suddenly you get to a number that's, you know, an order of magnitude different to that. But the only way to get to that is by doing the kind of survey or outcome assessment that you've been talking about. So does that mean that we need to be looking at a a KEF like a ref. You know, every 7 years we need to do a assessment of all our partnerships and go and get them to tell us all the things that we've, you know, all the benefits we've brought to them.
I'm not sure you'd do it in the same way. I'm not sure the system would tolerate doing it in the same way, I think you raise a really important point, which is, yeah, we know it's, again, that's the point about a proxy, right? We're trying to understand whether in some ways it scales with the ultimate impact. And so is there a kind of some kind of scaling factor which needs to be applied to get to the real number? But actually, you have 4.2 billion, whatever it is today, isn't the actual number, isn't the scale of the impact. You know, and there's some really interesting studies done in, I think, using MIT data, where they tried to back calculate the amount of sales that the licenses they were signing were generating. So then, can we try and back estimate the economic impact by looking at the sales enabled by licensing, based on the I think it's the royalty rates that have been charged. You can do similar things, I think, with spin-outs. You can try and get a sense of, you know, let's try and get a sense of the valuation of the companies and say, does that provide a better estimate? I think the problem is, it's once you get beyond those really quite tangible kinds of knowledge exchange, where there's some tangible thing, when you get into the more research partnering, when you get into CPD, it's much harder to then track and identify those tangible things that you can then count easily, and you can then estimate the larger scale of the return on investment. You're right, and I think that's right. You could do case study based work. I think the problem is that, just going back to the complexity of knowledge exchange, there are many types of ways in which knowledge can get out. There are many areas of the economy and society it can impact. So to do it, you'd almost have to try and systematically go through all of them and come up with a return on investment, which I think would just be one of those exercises that would be, you know, cost a huge amount of money to do, and to do properly. And does it get us anywhere, really? Does it help us unlock new types of funding, or does it get us to more easily demonstrate the value of this type of?
Well, it might get us to be seen as less than more than just a bit part in the process. I think that's my concern about it. So if government thinks that the only return is 4.2 billion of HEPC income, you know, I'm going to be less excited about it than if it turns out to be, you know, 40 or 100 billion, because of, you know, the value of the companies or the benefit that the organizations have had from the relationship.
Yeah, I think again, you'd have to bring on a policymaker to talk about how the narrative is viewed by, say, Treasury, for example. You know, over the years we've demonstrated significant returns to Hive, for example, that, you know, was what, 1 to 9-ish or something. And you know, we know that investing in this activity generates significant returns, and we you know, the narrative that goes with it is it's always an underestimate. That we believe this to be the lower bound of the impact, because of all the things that you're saying. And so, does it help doing? Does it help? The question is, what, you know, if we're going to pump a huge amount of money into this to try and get those numbers, what does it really enable you to do? And I agree. So it's that, you know, if you go back to the famous MIT study that showed that the spin-outs coming out of MIT, what, the 3rd or 4th largest economy in the world or something like that, you get into lots of difficult issues about attribution and things like that. So yes, you've enabled this amount of, you know, new products or new whatever services to be created, but then you've got to start thinking about what's the attribution of the university's contribution versus everybody else's contribution to that. It's a very difficult bit of work to be done, and ultimately I don't think you really get, you know, other than sort of really showing the contribution of universities and understanding how universities contribute. That to me is a really important bit of analysis. Is where are the problems, where are the barriers, where are the challenges that need to be overcome to get to that, to be unlocked, to unlock the opportunity, rather than really trying to get at the exact return on investment, which I think is, yeah, it's just, I don't think we'd ever get there.
No, but it's interesting. Mark Gray has put something in the chat about, what should be the outcome of an investment, you know, of that kind, you know, and can you get to, you know, does the government need to say, you know, what is the return it's expecting? You know, that would be you know, interesting, because I suspect we could demonstrate that we've hit that. And Jackie has talked. Jackie Barnett has mentioned all the things that go on which don't have money associated with them, and how do you deal with things which are, in a sense, activities that happen, moments that happen, but which don't have money attached to them, and what difference does that make? And she mentions the KEF, and I think we probably should just touch on the KEF. Yep. Then in our last 10 minutes or so, because theoretically, at least, the KEF allows us to compare ourselves against each other. Mm-hmm. Do you think, there's only been one round of it so far, do you think there are signs of there being a KEF effect? Do you think that this is helping us?
So just to touch upon the point that was made just now, because I think it links into this discussion about the KEF effect or where it might go and things like that. So I think the point about, you've got the income metrics, that's fine. The point about doing surveys and wider work is to understand the broader range of activities. And we know there's been quite a lot of work which tries to get at the range of knowledge exchange activities. And there was some work trying to get a sense of the extent to which they can attract, sort of monetary transaction or things like that. So we're getting some handle on it. We still need to do more. But at a kind of I think a system level, you can put together a picture of the evidence around the full range of things that's happening, and you can sort of make the case around the importance of certain types of funding programs that generate sufficient returns to continue to be invested in, and things like that. When you now translate it to a KEF system where you're trying to compare university to universities, that becomes, I guess, a little bit harder, because you're then saying some universities might do more of one versus less of another, and so then how do you construct a system that is fair to universities, of the kind of the KEF? And that's where I think, particularly around we saw with the local growth and with public engagement, recognition that there are the metrics don't really say much about those, so let's have an institutional, a narrative perspective to really get into the richness of those kind of activities. Curiously, when we did some work, there was a study commissioned by, I think it was then Hefke, rather than Research England, looking at the kind of the hard to monetize knowledge exchange activities. And they tried to look at the extent to which KE activities commanded transactions or not, and looked at that across the old clusters of universities that we used. And actually what you find is there's not a lot of difference between the different types of universities. That, big research universities do a lot of stuff that you can't count. Smaller universities, a lot of stuff you can't count. There's a huge amount of stuff we can't count in the system. How that ultimately washes out, I think, is it would be interesting. I don't think it would be hugely different to a distribution that you calculate based on income, just the scale of activities, for example. Mm. But onto the KEF and the KEF effect. I think the main thing that I've seen so far is the universities that did well celebrated it. It was all over Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever. It was, yes, we'd take universities that didn't do so well. It's caused a period of reflection and trying to understand why. And that, I think, is then fed back down to, well, is it the quality of data, how much effort we're putting into submitting data to HEBCI, how we interpret the guidance on HEBCI, is it real differences in form? So I think it started a dialogue. And to me, that's the real. And I remember saying at the beginning of the KEF process that, if the one thing that this really does is to get universities to pay more attention on the quality of the data they sort of collect and submit, and more attention to issues around performance and asking those kind of questions, then actually it's not necessarily a bad thing. It might have some positive outcomes. The other thing I've seen it has had as well is there's, I think, more of a discussion, a more serious discussion, I guess, about what metrics should we be collecting. Because, Researching, I think, did a fantastic job in constructing the KEF, given the constraints they were set by Joe Johnson, right? It had to be largely using existing data, which means you were relatively constrained in the metrics you could develop and the data that you could use. So I think that, for me, is we're now into looking, if we're looking into iterations, future iterations, 2, 3, whatever it might be, can we let's have a discussion about what new metrics would we would like to see, and then you get into the question, well, what's the data that's required to underpin those? But has it started that kind of discussion? I think we're at the beginning of it. I think we might start investing more time and effort in that discussion, which is good, a good thing.
Yeah, and the KEF consultation is still out there if anyone wants to respond. And Alex Anderson is, I think, urging us to say something about policy and cultural metrics and that sort of thing. Do you see any prospect of that sort of thing coming in?
I think there will be. I think so. I think it would be. I think it's an important area that is hidden in the KEF as it is at the moment. There are, I think, big challenges about how you get good data, or even data, on the extent of policy engagement and things like that. But it's an area that I think is being actively considered, and people recognise that the work with policy is really important. And I think, you know, HEBCI, and I think so. You know, there's the KEF consultation. There's the HEBCI review as well, and you know that the data set was constructed 20 years ago, and things have moved on quite considerably. And actually, I personally would love to see, you know, the kind of the work with the public sector versus charitable institutions separated. I think you have different dynamics. You perhaps work in slightly different ways, and actually that would be really helpful as well. So I think there's different things we could do through the different consultations and reviews, but we need to take this seriously, because this is our chance as a community to influence the state of national data collection and what happens, I guess.
Yeah, and Sonia is asking about whether we could possibly make it not every year, which I think many of us would be excited by. But actually, the work is done separately, isn't it? Once the data is running, someone can collect it.
And that was the challenge from Joe Johnson, is that this should be largely be data driven. It should largely not be a burden on universities. Now, I guess the question is, what happens to the public engagement and the local growth perspectives where it's a narrative? Is there an expectation that universities update that on it every year? But once the rest of it, once you've set it up, it's supposed to be an updatable thing. And actually, that's the idea, is that you see the dynamics of the system changing and over time. There's another interesting question about, how often do you revisit the clusters? Given that I was the one that developed the clustering methodology, but that's a really important question. Is it 3 years, 5 years? But how often do you look at relook at the clusters and say, look, the system may have changed by now, and the groups of universities with the idea was trying to group them into groups with similar characteristics. They may have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And Elaine Edgington is saying, has it helped to raise the profile of KE within top levels? I think definitely. As soon as you get into anything where you're being judged against someone else, people get excited about it. So we've got 3 minutes left. It's probably just a time for a few moments about future trends, yes. I think. So what do you see? What do you think are the key things and the sorts of things you're going to focus your effort on in the next few years?
Well, so we've just started a project looking at how, we've been through this time. Turbulence, I think, is the word that characterizes where the time we're in at the moment. And it's not just COVID, right? It's not just the pandemic. There have been lots of changes afoot: Brexit, the net zero, the climate change, the climate crisis, and trend towards the need to get to net zero, leveling up and huge spatial inequalities in the UK, and the government currently waking up to the need to do something about that. We've got a government with a very different look and feel to previous governments, certainly in my professional career. I think we're in a time of big change. And one of the things that we're doing at the moment is starting a piece of work trying to understand the effects of this very turbulent time on universities as we journey through this turbulent time. Trying to understand, what do they do? How is it influencing their organization? What are the major threats and challenges they're facing? What are the opportunities? It does open up potentially significant opportunities for some universities more so than others. But then that raises a big question about, well, what are the resources and capabilities we need within the system to go up to address those challenges, to overcome the threats, and to go after the new opportunities? Universities aren't, they take time to steer, to reconfigure, to go after new opportunities. What more does government need to do to help that process? I mean, we're in a period of significant change. So I think that's one big piece of work we're trying to do. We're just starting up, and we will be doing. And I think there is also, there's a lot of pressure on universities, I think, to demonstrate their value again. And going back to some of the concerns I was having earlier this year, I think those haven't necessarily gone away. In that, I think we need to do more to really communicate the complexity of what universities do in a very simple way. but without getting into kind of universities this, companies that are very simplistic ideas of the process. But we need to find ways of communicating that and the evidence behind the contributions that universities make and the value it brings to the system to well beyond the kind of the knowledge exchange bubble and those policymakers that are very strongly tied into it. How do we get the message out much further and much wider, I think, is a big challenge.
Yeah. Well, we're all relying on you, I think, Thomas, to help us with that. We've come to the end of our time now, so thank you very much for joining me in the shed, and thanks for having me in your shed today. And thanks also for your for the Spitfires, which were a great accompaniment to all of that. But thanks very much for sharing us your insights in this turbulent time. And I'll hand back to Maxine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thomas, thank you so much again for your time this afternoon. I was going to make a comment about the Spitfires too, because that's a first, which is great. Just always so interesting to hear from a real expert with such in-depth knowledge about us and how our stakeholders might view the world as well. So thank you very much. That's it for today. We have taken this one right to the wire. I'll let you all go and have a good summer, and we'll see you online again soon. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.